We are tier ranking the modernist poets today, and the modernists are so underrated because if you look at most poetry books getting published today, a lot of them aren't better than what these modernist poets we'll be discussing today were putting out. So let's hop into this. And my name is Ian, and on this channel we discuss everything book, writing, and poetry related. I've reviewed and will be reviewing a bunch of poetry books. I give advice to aspiring poets on how to market themselves, and of course, poetry writing tips. But we need to talk about one of the OGs of the game first, and her name, the only female on the list today, is Marianne Moore. And of course, I got a soft spot in my heart for Miss Marianne Moore because she is a nature poet. And on this channel, we cover a lot of nature poets, and she does it very, very well at a high level, as we're going to be reading in a second. With a lot of these poets, we'll read some of their, maybe a poem or two from them, so you guys can see maybe why I'm ranking them high. I mean, everyone on this list, honestly, is a good poet, but we're kind of looking at three different things today: who they were as a poet and a person, how good their work was, and then three, their legacy, or how the work stands to this day. So if we look at Marianne Moore, she's a forgotten poet. I will say that. She's kind of made a comeback. Her collected work, a lot of these poets too have their works now in the public domain, so they're having a resurgence. A lot of people are putting out complete works, and there's been a resurgence with the modernist poets because of that, because you don't have to go through all these estates and copyrights anymore. So Marianne Moore, though, I'm going to give Miss Marianne Moore an A, because I really love her work. Her impact and what she did, not just for female poetry, but just in poetry in general. She is a top tier modernist poet. She was kind, she helped people, and she could sling some poetry and was experimental with what she was doing. So we are going to read one of her poems now, titled Fish. Wade through black jade. Of the crow blue mussel shells, one keeps adjusting the ash heaps, opening and shutting itself like an injured fan. The barnacles which encrust the side of the wave cannot hide there for submerged shafts of the sun. Split like spun glass, move themselves with spotlight swiftness into the crevices, in and out, illuminating the turquoise sea of bodies. The water drives a wedge of iron through the iron edge of the cliff, whereupon the stars, pink rice grains, ink, bespattered jellyfish, crabs like green lilies, and submarine toadstools slide each on the other. All external marks of abuse are present on this defiant edifice. All the physical features of accident, lack of cornice, dynamite grooves, burns, and hatchet strokes, these things stand out on it. The chasm side is dead, repeated. Evidence has proved it can live on what cannot revive its youth. The sea grows old in it. Honestly, we're going full screen. That's some fire right there. Let's get a round of applause right now for Ms. Marianne Moore, a legend in the game. Like I said, a lot of her completed works are out there. I would recommend going and checking them out, or just assembling, finding a collected works. Like I said, her nature poetry is top notch, especially for the times. I can only think maybe of Robinson Jeffers, who's really not a modernist poet, who was really slinging like she was in terms of the nature scene at the time. And a lot of these poets do, but she was very direct with it and did it a lot, which some of these authors kind of move through it, but she did it very well. Next on our list, we have another obscure poet, Cesar Vallejo. Does anyone in here know Cesar Vallejo? So Vallejo is a Peruvian poet and the only South American poet on our list today, and he is a master. And I mean, I'm not even gonna tease you guys. He is absolutely receiving an S, and everyone should go. He has his there's a book out there, I think, of his collected works. It has a black and white cover, has the Spanish translations on one side. Absolute banger. And we're going to read some of his poems right now. I will die in Paris on a rainy day. On some day I can hardly remember. I will die in Paris, and I don't step aside. Perhaps on a Thursday, as today is Thursday, in autumn. It will be a Thursday, because today, Thursday, setting down these lines, I've put my upper arm bones on wrong, and never so much as today have I found myself with all the roads ahead of me alone. I mean, are you kidding me? Like I said, go find a poetry magazine and find a poem in it that got published this year that is contending with. I don't want to, I get in, and all he's doing here is just observing, and he's feeling, and he's going deep. There's no objective, there is no agenda, there was no creative writing program, there was no grant, there was no funding. We have a man here who's living a life, experiencing life, and going inward. That's what makes you a legend. That's what brings you to the S tier. Nothing else. Not worrying. He died I think he was like 46 when he died. Vallejo did not live some extravagant lifestyle. Was no professorship or grants or any of these things. Just the love of the craft. And with most of these authors, as we're about to see, the ones at the top of the list respect it. The ones at the bottom way too much going on. And we need to cover another one. This one's actually my favorite by him, and it's even better than that one on screen. I wonder what she's doing at this hour, my Aideen and sweet Rita of reeds and wild cherry trees. Now that this weariness chokes me and blood dozes off, lazy brandy inside of me, I wonder what she's doing with those hands, that in attitude of penitence used to iron starchy whiteness in the afternoons. Now that this rain is taking away my desire to go on, I wonder what has become of her skirt with lace, of her toils, of her walk, of her scent of spring sugar cane from that place. She must be at the door, gazing at a fast-moving cloud. A wild bird on the tile roof will let out a call, and shivering she will say at last, Jesus, it's cold. Very deep, has a lot of grief. I mean, a wild bird on the tile roof will let out a call, and shivering she will say at last, Jesus, it's cold. He's longing for a past lover, this past lover, and she's older now, and I wonder what has become of her skirt with lace, of her toils, of her walk, of her scent of spring sugar cane from that place. Imagining, bringing it. I mean, this is... we're talking about the early 1900s here too, everybody. I mean, this is very high level stuff. If people can write with this beauty now, it's an accomplishment no matter what era you're in. People who write like this should be given a very easy life to write more like this, maybe even a harder life if they need grief to grow. So yes, Cesar Vallejo, look him up. There's many good poems like this. Like I said, you're a poetry lover, go read his collected works. Next, we have the boogeyman, the absolute boogeyman of, these tiers, like I said before, Ezra Pound is very controversial. If you guys don't know about Ezra Pound, obviously you probably know he was a famous poet, very talented poet, but in the late 1930s, he got sucked into fascism. He was born in Moscow, Idaho, I believe, was hanging out with the expatriates, Hemingway, in France and Italy and other things, and he got sucked into Italy, with Mussolini and the whole 9 yards. Eventually started broadcasting Italian fascist propaganda as a radio host, and eventually he got locked up, and obviously an anti-Semite among other things, a racist, probably even a sexist. After the war, he gets locked up. He was held in a cage, and at this time when he converted or did whatever, he's the top poet in the world. He's considered one of the best in the world at this time, or was maybe a decade or two earlier. So this comes to an absolute shock. People lost their minds when people, certain poets, I don't even know what poets, but when certain authors maybe came out and supported Trump. But now looking back those 4 years, nothing really happened. Imagine when the best poets in the world supporting and actually doing things to help one of the most brutal maniacs of the last couple centuries. So Pound is locked up, and then he's held in an insane asylum for, I think, 10 to 15 years. So obviously his legacy is tarnished, and what do we do with that? And I'd like to bring into this chat and into the consciousness, I like to call upon the gods and bring in our boy, I have to, Mr. Ernest Hemingway, because his perspective is important, because he was there with Pound for decades. He knew Pound. He knew about his influence and what he was doing. So let's hear from Ernest about what he thinks about, Pound and his legacy. Ernest Hemingway wrote to his friend Archibald, who was campaigning for Pound's release, because they were trying to get him released for a long time, because they're like, look, why is one of America's and one of the greatest poets in the world being held in a jail? I understand, or in an insane asylum. Like, I understand that he, is crazy and made mistakes, and he's even now saying crazy things, but, this isn't really right. Thanks for sending the stats of Ezra's rant. He's obviously crazy. I think you might prove he was crazy as far back as the latter cantos. He deserves punishment and disgrace, but what he really deserves most is ridicule. He should not be hanged, and he should not be made a martyr of. He has a long history of generosity and unselfish aid to other artists, and he's one of the greatest living poets. It's impossible to believe that anyone in his right mind could utter the vile, absolutely idiotic drivel he has broadcasted. His friends who knew him and who had watched the warping and twisting of and decay of his mind and his judgment should defend him and explain him on that basis. It will be completely unpopular, but an absolutely necessary thing to do. And Pound was known for helping anyone and helping so many poets make their career and get money and help them find living situations. He was actually so much so that it was actually hurting him that's what they said, that another quote, I don't have it here, that they said Pound could be the GOAT of all time, but he only spends 10%. He spends 10% of his time writing and 90% of his time helping other people market and do their things with poetry. Like, he was a very selfless person during, that early era. And like, what do we do with that? We know what we do with people now. People now do things 1,000 times less than what Ezra Pound did. Obviously, spewing Nazi propaganda and helping them out. And we canceled them. And we have some great thinkers. A lot of these thinkers on this list today, almost every single one of them that literally every single one of them that associated with Pound said, why are we holding this man in an insane asylum. I mean, obviously it's a political hit, and obviously he's crazy. He has problems. But anyway, let's talk about his ranking. Enough about Pound. I had to give you guys a backstory. Let's talk about his poetry though. I mean, obviously, so I don't know. So like in terms of who he was as a person, him being a crazy fascist is at the bottom, but him being a selfless poet who helped people maybe raises him up a little bit, not all the way, obviously. But if we look at his poetry, even back then, it was average at best. There were some breakthroughs. There's obviously some really good poems. But honestly, if we're scaling this, there was a bunch of crap. And I'm leaning, so right now I'm thinking a C, right? But there's something else that Pound did that I think really helped his legacy. And he brought a lot of Eastern thought and Eastern poetry, Confucianism and Chinese poets to the West, which was so important. Pound was one of the pioneers in terms of bringing the East to the West in terms of the literary scene, and that is immense. That is there's no way to thank him and the lives that he impacted from all the people that then sprouted out from that movement. You just think of the hippie movement and the whole spiritual movement. Like, he has a place in like bringing that to America and to public, Eastern consciousness to Western consciousness. So I'm honestly going to give him a high C. I want to give Pound a B, but he is probably like I said earlier, he's probably the most talented poet of this whole group, but he never capitalized on it. And he had personal issues. He had an ego issue. He thought that he was some economist mastermind. Like, there was a lot of problems that held him back, and his poetry reflects on it. It's not very timeless. A lot of these poets, not a lot of them, but some have timeless work. He really doesn't. Next on our list is an American legend, obviously. Most of these people are American. Robert Frost. And Robert Frost, he might be considered, a lot of these poets, so, I had to make some judgment calls here about who's a modernist, who's not a modernist, and we can debate on that, but I just want to bring some people in also to talk about them and bring them to you guys. I think they deserve a place at this table, because am I going to do late 19th century tier ranking of poets? Maybe, but not probably very soon. Well, actually, maybe I should, so I can crap on a bunch of them, because late 19th century poetry. Robert Frost, so it wasn't late 19th century. He was a little bit later in terms of his peak, but I'm going to give Mr. Frost a B. I really feel like Frost's legacy is important, and he paved the way for a lot of poets. If you look at a lot of poets who came after him, if you look at Charles Olson and Robert Bly, James Wright, Gary Snyder, Joanne Kiger, like a lot of them, big poets, pre-beat poets, a lot of the pre-beat poets and the beat poets, a lot of them liked Robert Frost, and Robert Frost was a big influence for them. And his poetry still holds up today. He has a lot of good stuff. There's some crap in there, but he has a very high peak. And his use of language and the studying of language, and it said that he would talk for hours a day, that like he would just write poetry, look around and just have conversations with anyone and everyone for hours per day. That was like his life. It was just chatting. And he had this language about him. He had Frost's poems have a nice language. I'm low B. It feels weird putting him above Ezra Pound, but I'm not scared to stir up some controversy, man. I've gotten so many random comments blasting me for some of these picks, man, on my other videos. Next, we have the one and only T.S. Eliot. And man, this one's a hard one too, because I feel like Eliot's a C or a B. Like anyone that, he's rising on my list. So we can give Eliot, honestly, I'm gonna give him a C, because it's average. If like some of these other people who are gonna be in the A and the S, if I look at his work now, like I have grown to love and understand a lot more some of T.S. Eliot's works, but when I compare them to Cesar Vallejo, to Rilke, just put Rilke and T.S. Eliot next to each other, and like, okay, one's an S and one's average. Good stuff. C's an average. It might be a little bit down the slope, but it's not a D. It's not an F. And T.S. Eliot, once again, was a poet who I think just needed more time. I think just needed a lot of these people. If you look at who's making the list, if we look at Marianne Moore, Cesar Vallejo, like Rilke, Lorca, some of these other guys I'm going to throw up at the top, they had more connection with their subconscious. They explored a little bit more. They had a little bit more connections with symbols. They weren't so focused. And I know they maybe came a little bit later, maybe they were 10 years older or younger, and had a little bit more space. But, I feel like T.S. Eliot is like a Madonna, and some, or like maybe not a Madonna, but like a very good pop icon that deserves the praise. But we all know behind the curtain in the industry that like he's not the best, and he never got. And I shouldn't say this because T.S. Eliot was never that famous. I remember this one account of T.S. Eliot talking that he had this very famous magazine, right? I forget what it was, but he was running this magazine. It had writings from all these different people. Everyone was submitting to it, and someone asked him how many subscribers he had to the magazine. He said 300. He T.S. Eliot had to be a banker for a lot of his life. He was moving in and out of jobs and had to basically mooch off of people to make it by. You know, it was a hard life back then for a lot of these people, and not everyone was living the extravagant Ernest Hemingway lifestyle. You know, poetry has never, until recently, when people, you know, when it's just been forced onto people with the university system and like a false market, you know, poets never really made money. And as we're going to talk about in a second with Yeats, you know, that's not the point. You actually shouldn't. It actually kills the craft, and that's what's kind of preserved poetry, and that's why poetry is kind of getting weird. The more money that enters poetry, the worse that it gets, because that's what happened to the novel. At some point, the novel became something that, you know, you could sell at airports and market it very well, but people have never really figured out how to market poetry. For instance, there's a very famous, I won't mention who it is, but there's a famous woke poet out there who has a pretty big following, and they had to fight. I mean, she had to fight to get a 6-figure book deal really hard, and basically had to cry and say that the publishing industry was prejudiced against her for her to get her deal, and she made a huge ruckus in terms of, but you know, I'm pretty sure they're going to take an L on that, because as I talk about on the show, it seems like every single video, that in 2020, 97% of books published by large houses sold less than 5,000 copies. Thus, 90% of published authors make less than $10,000 for their book. And those numbers aren't probably including a lot of poetry. So anyway, T.S. Eliot, I'm throwing him in at a C. Next, we have Wallace Stevens, and I'm going to throw Mr. Wallace Stevens up at a B. I feel like Wallace Stevens, he had his own problems. He was a racist, among other things. He had some problems, and he had in his poetry, a lot of it's campy and a lot of it is problematic, but he can reach the highs. He wrote, he can write things much like Robert Frost that are very beautiful and very high level. Did it happen all the time? No. Were there gaps in his career and his thinking? Yes. But some of Wallace Stevens has some of the best poetry of, the 20th century. No two ways around it. So Mr. Wallace is for sure going in the B category. Next, we have Antonio Machado. Anyone in here know Antonio Machado? Mr. Machado is an absolute legend in the game. And once again, everyone needs to go check out his work. And I have one of Machado's poems here, so let's examine that, read that. There's a space here I couldn't get rid of. Last night, as I was sleeping, I dreamt, marvelous air, that a fiery sun was giving light inside my heart. It was fiery because I felt warmth as from a hearth, and sun because it gave light and brought tears to my eyes. Last night as I slept, I dreamt, marvelous air, that it was God I had here inside my heart. Oh, sorry everybody. Let's try this again. Those are the last two stanzas. Whoops. All right, we're trying again. Last night as I was sleeping, I dreamt, marvelous, that a spring was breaking out in my heart. I said, along which secret aqueduct, oh water, are you coming to me? Water of a new life that I have never drunk. Last night as I was sleeping, I dreamt, marvelous air, that I had a beehive here inside my heart, and the golden bees were making white combs and sweet honey from my old failures. Last night as I was sleeping, I dreamt, marvelous air, that a fiery sun was giving light inside my heart. It was fiery because I felt warmth as from a hearth, and sun because it gave light and brought tears to my eyes. Last night as I slept, I dreamt, marvelous air, that it was God I had here inside my heart. And that one's, one of the better ones of Antonio Machado, but there are a lot more. And Antonio Machado, once again, because he didn't get discovered. He was a poet who was writing and didn't really get discovered until the 40s, 50s, and 60s. By the time he was basically dead. So he didn't have this modernist impact, but he was really writing with the modernists. And he had a major impact on a lot of the beat and, poets in the 60s and 70s. So, and I think that rightfully so. So I'm going to give, here we go, Mr. Machado an A. I really think that he is better than Frost, Wallace, and Pound and Eliot. Next on the list, we have William Carlos Williams. And William Carlos Williams' poetry, pretty good. I really like Patterson, but he put a lot of work out there. For instance, his book Imaginations. I would recommend that to everybody. Imaginations is like almost like a creative writing course in a book from like a famous modernist poet, like better than anything else put out around that time. And it has poetry interlaced in it and narrative, and it's kind of weird. But he really talks about the image and love and many other things. Go check it out. Imaginations by William Carlos Williams. And I'm so sorry, I was looking at the end. Somehow I thought that this is William Carlos Williams. Excuse me, everybody. Not this. Sorry, they look the same. This guy kind of looked like a doctor. This is Yeats. How could I ever forget Yeats? Sorry. Whoops. Sorry, William Carlos Williams, though. I'm going to give him a B because of this. I really think that he did a better job than Ezra and Pound just in his totality of his work and his life. And I think that he maybe deserves a bit of a bump. Maybe not, though. Honestly, we can give him a C. I think all these guys compared to everyone else are just a run below, even though the three most famous, you know, here are the controversial picks coming in. Yeats. All right. Sorry. William Butler Yeats. Might be Yates also. Sorry. I think it's Yates. Here, dude. I'm so sorry, everybody. I'm butchering names. Here we are again, everybody. But William Butler Yeats has been one of the biggest influences on my poetry and my thinking in general, his philosophy of writing poetry. And I think that he for sure is and goes into the A category. He might even fall into the S, but Yeats is, yeah, one of my favorites for sure. I think has obviously made a huge impact in poetry in general. If you look at Bob Dylan, a lot of other people, he was a huge influence on so many, Van Morrison, so many great people that you wouldn't expect. Next, we have Lorca. And Lorca is such a bizarre poet. And I don't know if we could count Lorca as a modernist, but you know, I'm going to give him an A also. I really feel like Lorca, his poetry is iffy, but his work on In Search of the Duende and his experimental style and like what he was trying to push out and the way he maybe was the next step beyond modernism, I think is commendable. This photo right here is nothing. And then last but not least is the master himself. I think the peak modernist poet, better than everybody else, Rainer Maria Rilke. And Rilke is nothing. You could go read Sonnets to Orpheus, Duino Elegies, some of it, his love songs to God book. I mean, an absolute legend, was functioning at a very high level. Some stuff that you could put out now and it would still be good. Was deeper. I mean, we read Machado and Vallejo, but when you read Rilke, if you've never have, man, it has depth and layers. And he was kind of a piece of crap as a human being, but overall as a poet, I think he was the best poet until probably Robinson Jeffers. I don't even know if Robinson can contend with him. He was the best poet for a long time and still holds that title in my heart. So what did you guys think about all my picks? Let me know what I messed up, what I got right, and then check out this video right here where tomorrow I will be tier ranking the German idealists.